Is there anything that God cannot do? That's a good question. Is there anything that God cannot do? Well, I think the answer might surprise you. And if you want to know what the answer is, stick around as you're watching the Small Town Pastors Podcast. Okay, so I'm Rev Jordan. This is a Small Town Pastors Podcast, and we just talk about Christian things from a small town pastor's point of view. I want to answer this question. Shout out my cousin Nathan. Appreciate you bringing this to me. And before I do, I want to make a little disclaimer. First of all, we as Christians believe this central thing about God. He's omnipotent. That means he's all-powerful. He can do whatever he wants. And this speaks to his ability, that he has the ability to do whatever he wants. But I do believe that there are two categories of things that God cannot do by definition that don't necessarily relate to his ability. Okay, so the first of these is character, right? There are some things God cannot do based on his character. He has the ability to do them, but he does not have the character to do them. Or a better way to put it is his character prevents him from doing those things. The first of those would be sin. God cannot sin. He cannot do any wrong. He is the moral lawgiver. Anything he does is by definition moral. So there's no possibility for him to sin, because even if he were to commit a sin, which he can't, and he doesn't, but even if he were, it would no longer be a sin, because God is the one that defines what is right and wrong. This is something called divine command theory in philosophy. We as Christians hold a version of it, and it's important to understand that God is the standard of righteousness, not that we are or culture is, even though we sometimes latch onto that. And because of that, we can understand that there are some things God cannot do because his character will not allow him to do so, right? And anytime God does something, it is always justified by his own nature, because he's the justified one. He is the one that creates the rules. Not only though can he not sin, he cannot tempt people to sin. He cannot convince people or force people to commit sin on his behalf. He would be responsible for that sin, thus making him a sinner. Tempting people to sin is itself a sin, labeled in the Proverbs and elsewhere. And that is why God cannot do that. There's an example of this in Genesis where Abraham is told by God to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah. Now that would be a sin. Child sacrifice was not approved by God. It was a sin. It was condemned by God. But the temptation, it was about obedience to do something even sinful or that would cause the death of his child. The high risk of obedience, that's what this was about. It was not actually about sin, and we know this because in the end, when Abraham is about to complete the task, God prevents him from sinning. God was tempting him, absolutely, but not to sin. God was tempting him to obey, even if it meant that there would be utterly dire, sinful even consequences. But God knew that the sin would never happen. So God was never tempting him because he knew more than Abraham did and what we would have if we would have followed that story in Abraham's shoes. So God does not tempt people to sin. He does test and he does tempt, but not to sin. So there's another thing that God cannot do based on his character. Something else that he does on his character that he doesn't do all the time, but he can do some of the time, he does it, is interrupt our free will. When he created Adam and Eve, he gave Adam and Eve the ability to choose what they were going to do with their life. He gave them all of the freedom in the world and then one alternative, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And eventually they took that option, that tree of knowledge of good and evil. When they did, that expanded their free will to now they were free to choose because they knew how to do good things and evil things. That means every single person that's born since Adam or through Adam is going to do good things and is going to do bad things. Every single person is, because that's what we know. It is natural to us to know these things and then to do them. And we have to make a choice every single moment of our life between good or evil from now on. Whereas Adam's original state was, all he had to do was live life and it was good. It was always good unless he did the one thing, the opportune. So when God provided that opportunity to choose, it was a way to prove that he was willing to choose God over anything. And he had a very easy time. We now have to choose God over everything, and literally everything. We have a very hard time with that. God allows for this to happen, and he allows for our evil choices to exist so that our good choices can remain. There's a video on this, why bad things happen. It speaks a little bit more toward this, and so I would encourage you to look at that if you have more questions on this. So with this mindset, though, God has the ability to interrupt our free will. He just rarely does. He does sometimes, but very rarely. And there's a few exceptions that are given in Scripture. Think of it like this way, as just an imperfect metaphor. Think of it like you have a shoebox. And in this shoebox, you spin a top, one of those child's toys. You spin a top in that shoebox. Now that top is going to have its own little path, and it's going to deviate, and it's do its own little thing based on the spin that you gave it, right? But the borders that you put in it prevent it from doing anything outside of your control. And at any time, you can reach into that box, and you can stop the spin, you can deviate the path, you can reset it, you can do whatever you want with it. You are in total control of that top, even though when you spin it and let it go, it is now on its own path. Similarly, we too have been given the ability to be on our own path, but there are borders, like a shoebox's walls, that prevent us from various things, as well as the ability of God to just interrupt and control and decide. So God he has the ability to impact our free will. He chooses not to. And this reveals his character. And again, there is exception, but I would argue that more often than not, that he interrupts our free will rather than controls it, or rather than, is constantly pushing the choice of man. The second thing, so character. There's one thing that decides things God cannot do, that's character. Another thing is logic. God is a logical being, and he is a God of order, as it says in the New Testament. To that end, there are some things that are illogical that God cannot do. For instance, atheists have provided this conundrum and have presented it to Christians, and Christians caught off guard have no idea what to do with it. This conundrum is, can God create a stone that is too heavy to lift? Can God create a stone that is too heavy to lift? So if you answer yes, God can create a stone that is too heavy to lift, then you've just said God cannot lift a stone. There's a stone out there that he could create that he couldn't lift. That's something God cannot do. He's no longer omnipotent. You say, okay, well then it's not yes, it's got to be no. Well then you've just said God cannot create a stone that is too heavy to lift, meaning there's something out there God can't create. So either way, there's something God can't lift or God can't create. Is one way or the other, God's not all-powerful by definition, according to this conundrum. But the problem is, and this is what most Christians fail to realize when they first encounter this, is that this is complete and utter nonsense. It makes no sense. It is a hypothetical that always leads to an illogical presumption. It's like saying, can God smell the color purple? No, that doesn't happen. That's not a function of reality. You can't smell colors, right? God is all powerful, but there is a logical order. God created science. He's outside of science, but God created science. And with that, it was designed with an order. And the whole point is that he operates outside of it as the creator, but within it as a maintainer. Right? God uses science to maintain the world. He uses the science of biology to maintain the life of animals and humans. He uses the science of physics to maintain motion and fluidity in space and time and matter. God does all of these things within the order that he creates. So for us to present things that don't make sense or are illogical, sure, God can't do those things. Sure. But that's only because those things don't exist. Those things are not real. So there are two things that God cannot do. He cannot do things that go against his character. And he cannot do things that are just not real. By definition, since they're not reality, they can't happen. It's not that so much that God can't do them. So that's really the bulk of it, though. God has the ability to do pretty much anything, but he doesn't do everything. And there is a difference between having the ability to do everything and being required to do everything. Just because God has the ability to do everything doesn't mean he does. Just because God has the ability to control all of our decisions in life doesn't mean he does. He leaves it up to us, which is why the world is so screwed up. Because God, if he was the one controlling all our decisions, the world would look a lot better. He's not. He's letting us do this and screw it up on our own because this is what we asked for when we took the fruit in the tree. There will be a remedy to it, and eventually. Same thing with character. There's plenty of things God could do, and quite honestly, if we were God, that we would probably try to do selfishly. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He gives justly and lovingly himself to people that don't deserve it. And his character demands that he does what is right as well as what is loving. So it's not necessarily what's deserved. He doesn't do what is deserved. He does what is right and what is loving. And that's why Jesus coming on the cross and dying on our behalf of our sin and reversing the curse for us is something that God was not required to do. It's something he chose to do. He was able to do, but he didn't have to. And yet he did. It's an important thing to realize that God, there are a few things he can't do, but all of those things are things we don't want God to do. That wouldn't be good for us. Everything that God can do is useful and is good and is helpful. And it's unlimited in power and it's unlimited in ability. And it's probably important for us to realize how finite we are as well in comparison to this great, mighty, unlimited power that God has. So that's it. That's what God cannot do. He can't go against his character, and he can't do things that aren't real. That's basically it. If you have more questions, would love to hear them. Please like, comment, subscribe. You can comment your questions or shoot me in a message on Instagram. Come find me. I'm on there. As well, just email me. That'd be fine as well. And contact me. Would love to hear those things. Please subscribe so you can keep up on the videos that are coming out. Got some new ones that are some other topics that are pretty cool. They'll be a lot of fun, and it'll be exciting. All right. I want to thank everyone for being here. And until next time, this is Rev Jordan from the Small Town Pastors Podcast.